Before we begin, I want to let you know that this series features themes of violence, school shootings, and systemic racism. Please be advised. Previously, on Violence Week, we journeyed 13 years back in time to investigate a tasing that sent shockwaves through East Lansing.
You switched the dates up. That's obvious. On the tape, the dates are switched up.
Honestly, we probably looking at a couple years in jail. How many do you think, Mom? Assaulting a police officer?
And in the middle of this community debate about school safety and policing, a mass shooting occurred just blocks from East Lansing High School.
It was terrifying because, we talked about gun violence in schools, there were threats, but this was the genuine thing. There was a shooter at MSU and people were dying.
Why isn't anything being done? What's to keep this from happening again and again and again?
I'm Emily Reeves, and this is Violence Week. Chapter 3, Good Cop, Bad Cop. On a crisp summer morning, I found myself squinting in the sun, staring up at a large statue of a police officer. He's holding hands with a little boy, the child's bright face smiling up at him. Below, carved in stone, an inscription reads, "To have a friend, you must be a friend." I was here, standing outside the sheriff's office in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to attend a basic SRO training course put on by the National Association of School Resource Officers.
I'm feeling a little bit nervous. I drove in, there's a ton of cop cars. It's just not something I'm used to. I've never really been in a room full of cops all day.
In the wake of the MSU shooting, and all these dramatic school board meetings, all the debates about clear backpacks, metal detectors, and police in schools, I couldn't help but hear a cynical whisper creeping up. Was it all futile? In the world's most heavily armed country, could anything actually make schools safe from gun violence? I knew it was a question with no easy answers, but after talking to these high schoolers, I also knew that we owed it to them to look that question straight in the eye. And because so many people's answer to this problem is hiring more school resource officers, I decided to start there. Once inside, I entered a packed classroom where about 50 police officers from all over the Midwest were gathered. My eyes couldn't help but linger on the guns on their belts and back the blue stickers on coffee mugs. On the whiteboard, "What is best for the student? What is best for the school?" was written in large letters. The National Association of School Resource Officers, often called NASRO, offers these trainings all across the country. NASRO is the go-to association for all things school resource officers. They promote the concept that an SRO does more than just law enforcement. They believe their real value in schools comes from their role as an informal counselor and educator. I wasn't allowed to record the class, but to be honest, you probably wouldn't have wanted to hear it anyway. The course wasn't much more exciting than any workplace training I've been to before. Topics included understanding the adolescent mind and reviewing acronyms from the education world, like IEPs and 504s. My ears did perk up, though, when the class's instructor, Jim Larson, spoke about the rise in violence he and other SROs have noticed in the past few years. Right off the bat, I could tell that Jim was skeptical of me. But since I was here to talk to SROs about what they do, and no other officers in the class agreed to speak with me, I was ecstatic when he agreed to do an interview during our lunch break. Despite his reservations, I discovered that I liked Jim. He was stern yet passionate, and he livened up the day with stories from his 7 years of working as an SRO in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Most of his stories revolved around the relationships he made with students, like how he made it part of his daily routine to greet students who were getting into trouble. For Jim, the ability to make connections with students is an SRO's superpower.
Being an SRO is the best kept secret in law enforcement. It's different than working on the streets. Departments nowadays are going call to call to call, and they don't have the time to put into the background of a call. That's just the way it is. In a school, there's more time. So it gives the school resource officer the ability to slow it down, to dig more into the background of it. As an SRO, you get to know the good students and the so-called bad students. There is not a bad student, all right? It's a student that is having problems, that is having issues, but they're not bad.
I genuinely appreciated how the training encouraged officers to think about the bigger picture and consider the unique factors of working with teens and children. But I still couldn't help but question if a 5-day training could prepare an officer to shift from working on the streets to being an informal counselor for struggling kids. I asked Jim if it would be better to just hire more actual counselors instead.
I think it's fair to say that NASRO and most school resource officers that I know would love to see more counselors in there, but there's a need for SROs also. What is best for the kid? And that may be administration, it might be counselors, it might be the teachers, it might be law enforcement, but not one side of that is going to be able to decide what's best for every kid.
But why do SROs have to be a part of that team? Why not just have schools call 911 when they need help?
Primary reason, time. Think about this. If you have a school resource officer in that school and God forbid the shooting starts, isn't it better to have them there? Now, statistically, every day the chances of a school shooting is slim. But you go into any school that's had it and ask them, is it important that there's a school resource officer there? See what they say.
And how would you respond to the critique of SROs, which is that by being there all the time and by the reality that there's not that many serious incidents that are happening on a regular basis, that having that extra time leads to over-policing, charging issues that might not otherwise get brought to police's attention?
The idea that an SRO is in a school just to write tickets and make arrests is the wrong concept. It shouldn't be done that way at all, because we've learned that it shouldn't be done that way. We've learned that we can do so much more good for the school, and more importantly for the students. We still have to be police officers. But one of the things that we as SROs have is discretion. We don't always have to charge. We don't want to do that. Now, there's going to be times that I don't have a choice. You bring a gun into my school, I'm going to arrest you. That's the way it is. I don't have a choice. But at the same time, I'm also going to look at what's the background to it, because you're going to come back to my school, and that student still needs our help.
As criticism of policing in schools has grown, many argue that the problems with officers unjustly using force or arresting students stem from when an SRO's role isn't clearly defined. The point in the day when Jim became the most serious with the class was when he, in the oral version of all caps, reminded the class that their job is not to do school discipline.
The school resource officer should not do school discipline. If you have a school policy that they cannot wear baseball caps, and this is hypothetical, but if you have that school policy and you see this person walking down the hallway wearing a school baseball cap, that school resource officer should not enforce it. Now, that doesn't mean they can't, because of the relationship they've already made, go up to him and say, okay, hey, you're not supposed to be wearing the cap. Can you take it off? And if the kid does, great. That means our relationship is working. If the kid doesn't, it's a school rule. We don't enforce those, or shouldn't.
Many incidents in the past have started just like this. A police officer tries to enforce a school rule, and the student argues or says something that the officer finds disrespectful, and things escalate, resulting in an arrest and the student getting charged with disorderly conduct. But in this hypothetical scenario, even if the police officer isn't intending to enforce that hat rule, how is a student supposed to know? The request is coming from a uniformed police officer. And what does that do to the school environment for a kid who already feels uncomfortable with police? I asked Jim how he felt about the schools like East Lansing that have eliminated SROs because of all these issues.
In my 30-some years of law enforcement, there's always people that do not like police officers. And there's a group that's always going to love them. How does it change me? I still do my job. That's what I have to do. That's what I want to do, is go in, make a difference with these kids, build those relationships, and make better people.
Do you take it personally when someone doesn't like cops?
No. Because there's reasons that people don't like cops. And I'm not arguing their reasons. So as a school resource officer, it's part of my job to go out there and go, this is who I am. This is me. Let's talk. Let's build that relationship.
And as far as avoiding that school-to-prison pipeline, for Jim, it all goes back to picking the right officer.
Not every officer or deputy out there can become a school resource officer. You need somebody that wants to be around kids, and they need to be selected properly. One of the questions you asked earlier about is the officers that are coming across that we need to arrest, we need to do the pipeline to prison. Here's my question back. Are they properly selected? Are they properly trained? And are they properly equipped?
I thought this was really interesting because Marcus and Deandra basically said the exact same thing when we were debating whether or not East Lansing should bring back cops.
You should have some type of structure to make sure everybody feels safe. A police officer should be there, could be there, but it's just got to be the right police officer. You got to be there to make sure nobody's breaking the law. You can't be there to try to police high school stuff.
This was kind of wild to me. Marcus was unfairly followed around his school by a police officer and then got tased in the chest 2 times in front of hundreds of his peers who were in the lunchroom. The incident altered his entire high school experience, and he still thought a police officer should be in there? This further hit home for me just how nuanced this entire debate was.
And that's what I said about boredom too. Like, he must have been a little bored himself, because how do you feel even cool or comfortable following around a 17-year-old and tasing me? How you gonna go home and feel good about that? When you're supposed to be getting criminals, you're supposed to be getting grown men criminals that's really doing something. So if you're gonna be a police officer at the school, you just need to keep it law breaking. But if ain't no laws being broke, then you shouldn't even intervene. You should just let the school do the school. That's it.
But I think that is the problem, because that was the agreement they had signed between the school and the police department. That's what it was for. But that's what I'm telling you. It's hard to do that because then lines get blurred, and then the children that end up getting the short end of the stick they're of color.
Maybe they need a black police officer. But they do need something though, because you got to think. Times is crazy. You said that. Crazy. Times is crazy these days. And then somebody got caught with a gun at the school. So you might need that, but you just got to find the right fit. You got to do your research on the police officer you're bringing in. Is he good with people?
But how do you know? How do you choose and pick the right officer?
Before Marcus was tased, I never even questioned why there was a police officer in my school. Little did I know, my home state was actually the birthplace of policing in schools. Roll out your projectors, or smartboards, or whatever classroom technology your generation used. It's time for a short history lesson. In 1953, Flint, Michigan became the first to station police officers in public schools. Titled a Police School Liaison Program, it was built as a way to improve community relations with police and to address issues like delinquency and overcrowding. This was during a population surge called the Second Great Migration, when many Black people moved to Michigan from the South with hopes of working in the booming auto industry.
The Supreme Court rules in 1954 that pupils cannot be segregated by law on the basis of race.
The very next year, segregation in schools was declared unconstitutional.
It is a far-reaching ruling, a significant milestone in the history of a country proud of its heritage as a melting pot.
Sometimes used to enforce segregation, sometimes used to impose desegregation, law enforcement was brought to many schools for the first time, as communities around the country navigated this fraught transition.
Colored youngsters arrived under safe conduct by the guards.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school, under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
So, it starts with overseeing shifting demographics and racial tensions. And from there, each subsequent era's ideas about youth crime contributed to the spread of policing in schools.
Drugs, alcohol abuse, crack, cocaine. More and more, these words and the images they evoke are nightmares come true for parents, teachers, peace officers, community leaders, and the children themselves. Most disturbing is the young age at which our children are threatened. As our recognition of the drug problem has grown, so has our resolve to fight it. But our law enforcement officers are the first to say they cannot do it alone. Prevention is the key. And that's where DARE gives us hope.
keep a kid off drugs.
If, like me, you have memories of police in your schools, it's likely from when they came into your class to teach DARE, the infamous anti-drugs programming.
Hey, you want to smoke?
No thanks.
Oh, I'm gonna go tell everybody that you are a chicken.
Well, that's okay, Paul, but that's something I don't want to do.
Okay.
Good. How did he do?
Throughout the last 50 years, the role of police in schools continued to mirror the nation's fears. Fears that were intertwined with racist ideas about youth crime.
Every time a drug goes into a child.
In the 80s, they were all about drugs.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
In the 90s, they were the face of zero-tolerance policies, encouraged by tough-on-crime rhetoric.
Freedom is a precious gift.
In the 2000s, they were seen as an anti-terrorism measure.
And we owe the children of America a good education.
And as No Child Left Behind pressured schools to improve standardized test scores, educators had a whole new incentive to drive out low-performing students through disciplinary measures. You tired yet? All of these factors increase the desire to place more police in schools. But nothing in the journey to bringing SROs to schools was bigger than the 1999 Columbine school shooting.
Gunmen in trench coats and masks storm a suburban Colorado high school, spraying gunfire, sending frantic students running for their lives. Terrified parents wait for word. SWAT teams swarm the school, looking for the living, finding the dead. 2 suspects found dead. Who were they? Why did they do it? And after 8 school shootings in 2 years, many wonder, how could it happen again? Even the president seemed at a loss.
Perhaps we may never fully understand it. St. Paul reminds us that we all see things in this life through a glass darkly.
Tonight,
this intense media coverage planted the fear of school shootings deep in the American psyche. In response, the Justice Department's Cops in Schools program gave out more than $800 million for thousands of new school police officers. East Lansing got one of those grants in 2000, the year after Columbine. The big problem? There's not a lot of evidence that police stop school shootings. Because SROs are expensive, and as we know, public schools aren't rolling in cash, many districts, like East Lansing in the past, have only had one officer for an entire district. That means they might not even be at the right school if a shooting starts. And even if they are there, there's not great evidence that they are effective in stopping shootings. Studies that have compared shootings at schools with an SRO versus those without haven't found a difference in outcomes. There were armed police at Uvalde, Parkland, and other high-profile school shootings. There was even an armed officer at Columbine. In Parkland, Florida, the school resource officer for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High faced criminal charges for sheltering in an alcove outside instead of confronting a school shooter.
Heading toward the building in this golf cart, then taking position outside for 27 minutes, never entering the building. When it was all over, 17 people were dead, another 17 injured. Tonight, that Florida deputy is under arrest, charged with 11 criminal counts, including 7 counts of child neglect.
And at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, despite the fact that police first entered the school only 2 minutes after the shooter, it took 77 minutes for any of the nearly 400 officers there to intervene. Still, Texas Governor Greg Abbott responded by signing a law that requires schools to have an armed security officer at every campus. Yet, to their credit, there are a handful of documented times where an SRO has stopped a school shooting. In 2018, at a high school in Dixon, Illinois, an SRO chased a gunman away before anyone was injured. The same year, 2 SROs in Texas stopped a school shooter within 4 minutes, but 10 people had already been killed. And Nasro argues that SROs aren't just there to stop shootings. They believe they play an important role in preventing them. One report they point to the DOJ's Averted School Violence Report analyzes examples of how plots for targeted violence were thwarted. But it's important to note that the majority of these cases involved a student reporting a concern to a parent, a teacher, and yes, sometimes the school's SRO. So, with all these conflicting narratives about SROs, how can a district like East Lansing make informed choices about what actually makes their school safer? I thought it was time we found an expert in school safety.
Schools are these unique environments.
That's Dr. Justin Heinze, a public health professor at the University of Michigan's Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention.
When something happens at a school, it has this ripple effect and repercussions for not just the school community, but then also the entire town or city can be affected when violence happens within schools. You also have one of your more vulnerable populations. You have young people at schools. And so thinking through the natural inclination to want to have those people be as safe as possible, but at the same time, we don't want to create environments that prioritize safety so much that it ends up impacting the learning environment.
The university formed the Institute in 2021 with the goal of seeking a multifaceted approach to firearm injury prevention. It's a unique collaboration between all sorts of different departments at the university, bringing together researchers from criminology and engineering to public health and public policy, all in service of finding new, data-driven solutions to this public health crisis. And while gun violence has long been a concern, this type of research is fairly groundbreaking.
Right around 1999, there was some legislation introduced that effectively made it very difficult to fund firearm injury prevention research. And that lasted for probably about 20 years. And if you're familiar with research, it is not an instantaneous, we go out, collect some data, write it up, and there we go. It takes a long time to develop an expertise. It takes a long time to run the sort of studies that we want to do in order to make data-driven conclusions. And so to have that moratorium was really detrimental. So you had this nascent field that over the last 3-4 years has completely exploded.
What the data does show us is that despite the rise in school shootings, in many ways, violence in schools has decreased over the last decade.
We're seeing this countervailing trend where over the last maybe 10, 15 years, some of the violence that you and I might have worried about when we were in school, fights, bullying, to a certain extent, perhaps weapon carriage, they're all going down. But at the same time, we're also seeing an uptick, and a pretty severe uptick in some of that severe violence. So it's still very, very rare for parents who are listening that someone's going to discharge a firearm at school or there's going to be severe violence. But that does seem to be increasing. So here we have these two divergent trends that we're trying to figure out when data is scarce.
I shared the stories I had heard about the rise in violence post-COVID. I asked Dr. Heinze if there was data to back up those anecdotes.
You're not the first to notice it. And I think that's important because right now I feel like we are picking up on anecdotes. When it comes to school safety, we do have a couple of big data sources. The problem is they're lagged. It takes a good 2 to 3 years for some of that data to start showing up. So if you're asking me about what's available for me to think about violence within schools, I'm not seeing the effects of the pandemic. I'm not seeing the following year when people were doing this kind of transition return to school. And I'm certainly not looking at where we have students now back, for the most part, pretty much fully. And we are seeing these reports of some of the severe violence that's upticking. In my impressions, I agree. I think there was something about a COVID effect that I can't explain just yet about this spike in violence that was happening. And whether that's because there was a lot of unstructured time, whether it's because of the stress of the pandemic, we just don't know. And I would hate to think that we're still 3 years away from that.
It seems to me like violence in schools and school safety exists on a big spectrum, but because of the severity of mass shootings, when most people think of school safety, I imagine that they think of mass shootings.
Yeah.
Yeah, you already said it's very rare,
yes,
statistically. So do we place outsized emphasis on that?
Yes.
And how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is in no way to minimize the horrific effect of a mass shooting. Roughly 3% of students over the course of a year will bring, or at least admit to bringing, a weapon to school. So it's not as though we want to just ignore the problem and say, no, this is really rare, we don't have to think about it. But what makes me really concerned are how reactive schools can be to some of those mass violent incidents. If you see a Parkland or a Sandy Hook Elementary or Virginia Tech, and you immediately go back to a school board meeting and you have parents saying, what are you going to do to make our schools safe? To talk about now prevention and to talk about real upstream strategies like school climate and restorative practices and threat assessment, those things that we have a lot of evidence for and things that teachers and administrators tell us do work, that's a harder sell than how about an armed officer at the door? How about a metal detector? How about a camera that can identify with artificial intelligence a person walking up to the building that has a firearm in their handbag or something? Blinds that can drop down at a click of a button, panic buttons, gunfire sniffing dogs. These are all real things that schools are implementing or are thinking about implementing. And for me, I can't tell you definitively whether or not they are going to work. I really can't. What I can say is when those things are implemented, they cost money, so there's always opportunity costs. If you're going to have, automatic blinds that are bulletproof drop down, that means there's another part of your safety apparatus that's probably not going to be there, or it's going to be there for the really wealthy schools, but not for the rest of the schools.
Another thing that complicates decisions around school safety is that as much as people want to, understanding the impact of any individual factor in a school shooting is incredibly hard.
Maybe we find 100 cases of schools that had a shooting over the last 10 years, and then we find 100 other schools that look really, really similar to those 100, except for they didn't have a shooting. And then from there, we're trying to figure out, well, what was the difference there? Did they have an SRO? Did they have clear backpacks? What might it be? But that's not your standard RCT, randomized control trial, where you can really have a control condition. And that's never going to be possible in school safety, because at any point, if you believe something could work, you're not going to withhold that.
Dr. Heinze's favorite example of this is locked doors.
Not a lot of data suggests locked doors are good for preventing school shootings. Would you still suggest we lock doors? Of course we do. And we're never going to randomize schools to a condition where they don't lock their doors, for example.
And even for the schools that do spend money on security measures, implementation can be a challenge.
I mean, I have gone to schools where they have some of these very physical apparatuses, metal detector, not plugged in. Students just kind of walking around it. If you're going to implement some of these things, we need to make sure that we're doing them well. And it's not just a quick fix. Again, SRO, very visible. Cameras, very visible. Metal detectors, very visible. I think parents respond to that. I think schools and school boards respond to that because it feels like you're doing something. For us, without more data to support it, I would worry that they're not going to be effective if an event does happen.
I asked Dr. Heinze what he makes of the disparities in the narratives and data around police and schools that I've been wrestling with for the past few months.
So unlike some of the other spaces that we were talking about, the blinds and the monitors and the cameras and stuff, a lot of people have looked at SROs. There's a lot of information out there. My perception of the literature is that it is pretty mixed in terms of the efficacy piece. There's a broader question around police and their role in society, and then certainly by extension, their roles in schools. You can find some data to suggest that when SROs are present, the likelihood of criminal justice involvement goes up.
And just like with those unplugged metal detectors, to Dr. Heinze, it all goes back to implementation.
So I go back to, if you are going to have an SRO in the building, what are the trainings that we're going to try to provide to make sure that that SRO is ready and equipped to do the work that they're doing? If you're not going to have an SRO in the building, what are you doing to make sure that there are response professionals available? And when are you going to engage the police departments if necessary? And so having those things planned out before we just say, we're not going to do this anymore. And, we're thinking about places like East Lansing, Michigan, where you're in a relatively urban space. Well, what if you're in North Dakota or Oklahoma? Where are your emergency response resources? So all of those pieces play into broad recommendations for should we be doing this versus not? And I would agree with you that there is not an obvious answer, at least in my mind, or at least from the data that I've seen, whether SROs are making things safer versus more dangerous.
There's a mountain of trade-offs here. A trade-off between the day-to-day consequences of having an officer present and the fear of not having them there in a rare emergency. The trade-off in choosing whether to spend money on safety measures or investing more in support systems. Perhaps it is easier for schools to just hire more cops and purchase other physical security measures because, like Dr. Heinze said, those make people feel like something is being done. But it does seem clear that whether or not schools have an SRO, whether or not they might be able to prevent a school shooting, they cannot guarantee a safe school environment. schools need to develop comprehensive plans for any type of emergency situation and make sure everyone actually knows what to do if something happens. It's a lot more thankless work than just hiring an officer or buying a metal detector. I think it's time that we return to East Lansing. Next time on Violence Week.
I wish with all of my little heart that I could sit here and say that I could guarantee that our schools will be safe from gun violence. But that is not a guarantee that I can make as a school board member.
I can't speak on this without bringing up racism and just plainly that the people in that school are terrified of those kids. But we need police in here to protect us from them kids.
And East Lansing still had a decision to make. Cops or no cops? Violence Week is produced and hosted by me, Emily Reeves. My sound engineer is Corey Choi, with assistance from Christian Cuccinello. Special thanks to Tony Williams, Feyisayo Aluko, Liam O'Brien, and Sierra Fitch. Fact-checking by Nancy Gordon. Our theme song was composed by Reagan Sprinkle. Violence Week is a Silver Podcast Network production. Thanks for listening.